the audience. But so I'll go ahead and start. Welcome to the 12th annual Center for Reflective Citizenship Constitution Day Lecture Series. And let me just mention what the CRC is. The CRC was started in 2011, and as a place, a center where people can really reflect upon issues that are important for citizenship in a democratic republic. And one of the reasons it falls at the particular time that it falls is that in a bipartisan act of Congress, the late Senator Richard Byrd actually introduced the legislation first, but any secondary school or undergraduate institution in the country who receives federal funding is obligated to have a series of Constitution education programs in the week that the delegates in Philadelphia on September the 17th signed the Constitution. So that's the background to Constitution Day. And I want to mention too that we've done other programs with the CRC, but if you'll notice, you should have gotten a brochure, and if you'll notice, we're now the Dr. Richard Grutzmacher Constitution Day Lecture Series. This is in commemoration of a valued late colleague who had a deep love for civic and history education at UTC, and we're just so pleased. And if the Grutzmachers in the house would stand up, that would be wonderful. I think there are two in there, and also I want to recognize too, because our sources of funding come from the College of Health and Education and Professional Studies, and also we're supported by the Propasco Chair, and we're supported by the Jack C. Miller Center for Teaching Our Nation's Founding. And I want to give a shout out to all three of our funders, and particularly I want to mention Dean Rutledge, because one of the things she did was she got the administration to approve us as a center, and that was a good thing. And just to move to the introduction to the topic tonight, as you can see, it's religious freedom, economic freedom, and the Constitution. And we will do a symposium. In just a few minutes, I'll stop, and we'll have our first speaker, who is, and I'll introduce her now. And again, they've done much more than I have time to tell you about, but Ann Bradley is the George and Sally Meyer Fellow for Economic Education and Vice President of Economic Initiatives at the Fund for American Studies. And it has spoken, if you're worried about going to sleep when an economist speaks, you really shouldn't worry. And Cody Cooper, who is recently was tenured as an associate professor here, is a UC Foundation associate professor of political science at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and he's written, if you know who Thomas Hobbes is, he wrote a really good book on Thomas Hobbes, and he can make people laugh, but they learn from it, and he has other publications too. But it's like I say, I'm not doing the speakers a really good service, but this is a new thing, to do a symposium. And I'll close with mentioning the symposium schedule so you'll know. In just a moment I'll be sitting down, and Dr. Bradley will begin, and she will speak about 30 minutes, 32 minutes, right around then. Then she'll be followed by Professor Cooper, and he'll speak 12 to 13 minutes, and then they'll have a short series of interchanges in the order of the speakers, 3, 4 minutes, and then we're going to open it up And how many people have been to Constitution Day before? Stand up if you've been to, or put up your hands. You know we have robust Q&A. And the only thing we ask is that you not make a speech. And I'll be forced to cut that off. But you can ask any question you want of either or both of them. So with those announcements, I'll turn it over to Dr. Bradley.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Okay, great. Well, I'm Ann Bradley. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you for having me. I hail from Virginia, and I was commenting on what a nice afternoon it was, and I was warned that it's unseasonably cool today, so I'll take it. I think it's nice. I also want to thank Lucien for the ringing endorsement that I'm not going to put you to sleep at 7:30, because that's actually reasonable as an expectation from hearing for an economist. I don't know if I'm doing that. Are you on? There you go. That's all right. So what I want to do in very short order, as Lucien said, I don't have a lot of time, and we want to save time to exchange with each other, but also to dialogue with you. As an economist, understanding the intersection of both economic freedom, religious freedom, and political freedom. So all those things work together. I'm sorry about this mic. I'm not sure if maybe I hold it. Is that better? Can you still hear me? The buzzing is bad, isn't it? Okay. So I want to start out with what I think the goal is. And if you were in the seminar that we had this afternoon, I talked a little bit more explicitly about human flourishing. And I could spend all night just on that topic, but I can't. So I just want to set forth, and as we think about the context of the American founding and the context of the founding documents, this idea of human flourishing was really important to the articulators of those, not only documents that ended up being the American Constitution, but in the early colonies and state constitutions and things like this. So this idea of shalom or human flourishing has economic implications to it. So I have a couple of different just excerpts from different thinkers on shalom. The first is a theological interpretation. This also has philosophical interpretations. It's relevant to political philosophy and other things. And so it's a robust and rich topic, but really important for the vision of where we're going and what type of society founding documents would try to protect. Because that's the idea, right? So human flourishing has these economic elements, which is health, wholeness, resulting in strength and fertility and longevity. And I'm going to talk to you in a minute. I'm actually going to show you a graph, don't fall asleep, about how much this has changed just in recent history, but certainly in the past 200 years, not just in the United States, but abroad. So we're experiencing a lot more material abundance, and with that comes not just material wealth, but other things like a moral order, like cooperation, charity, all these types of things that we view specifically as Americans as really important. The other sorry, maybe I'll just shout. So these natural law type of explanations or understandings of human flourishing. And Sam Gregg, who's a political philosopher, says it's knowable by all and choosable by all, meaning we can understand as part of our humanity, as part of being human beings, we can understand this idea that we want to experience happiness, right? So there's long and deep philosophical traditions around that. So here's the graph. And this is really remarkable. So I know economists get excited about graphs and data, but I think you should too. Deirdre McCloskey calls this the great enrichment. And if you look at this graph, what it's showing you is the percentage of people who lived in absolute poverty, which usually is judged as living around under $2 a day, but it's different kind of nuances around that number, which you see in this graph. But in 1820, by any measure, either 84% of people on the planet lived in absolute poverty, or 94%, and that's under the $2 a day benchmark. And so just what we're seeing just since 1820, which in the long story of human history is a blink, is a radical escape from material poverty. And we should look at that and want to ask real questions about how we get that, how we get more. And, you know, happy to talk more in the Q&A too. Certainly the United States has an experience of lots of material abundance. And there are other countries who have not fully experienced the great enrichment. And that leads to not just low incomes, but less ability to fully participate in the robust understanding of human flourishing. And so for economists, I think we need to do a better job of saying this is not just about getting more stuff. More stuff is great. But that about rising incomes gives us autonomy, choice, agency, okay? And that these ideas were really important to the founders, and they wanted kind of to think about a world where we could have more of that. Here's another way to look at it. This is called the hockey stick graph. So this is kind of the flip side of what I just showed you, which is looking at world GDP over the last 2 millennia. So starting in AD 1, which obviously we didn't have IRS tax records then, so calculating income was harder. But of all the people that have tried to calculate it, their ranges are pretty similar. And what we believe is that people lived on between $1 and $3 a day for most of human history. They lived in kind of zero-sum game types of society, where if you were on the top, you had whatever wealth there was, you also had power, and you could control other people. So you could control the path, the directives of their lives, and one person could yield that type of power over another, and so people were excluded from not only income mobility, but the telos of flourishing. And so this radically changes. When I ask my students why, they rightly say the Industrial Revolution, but that's just the kind of the start of thinking about, well, why? Why did the Industrial Revolution take so long, and what are the ideas that are important behind the Industrial Revolution? So I think these were really important for the founders and for the American experiment. And so just briefly, and I think probably in the Q&A, and Cody will maybe talk about some of these things, but like there was a lot of disagreement among the founders, so we don't have to have the view that they were unanimous on everything. They certainly disagreed. They disagreed about what was going to go into, what was going to be articulated in the founding documents, and they certainly disagreed afterwards about what that meant and how it would be operationalized. But things that we know are true was that there was a agreement on the not only property rights from a justice perspective, right, which is that people have a right to their persons, to their property, and that the role of the state is to protect, so a protective function of the state is to protect one's property and person from exploitation, from confiscation, but also they recognize the efficacy of property rights, that a system of private property rights would yield things that were beneficial to people and to the community at large. And they rested these ideas on dignity, the human dignity that should be universal, and the idea of natural rights, right? Some of those that I just mentioned. They had conversations and agreement about open markets, right? That there would be the ability to engage in commerce. So they did understand this notion that there would be a commercial republic, that the states would trade with one another, and that trade would yield material well-being and cooperation. They also agreed that there should be some soundness in the currency. So obviously these things factor very much into the American tradition. But what I'm going to talk about in a minute is that they also happen to be really important for economists as we measure something called economic freedom. And so what I want to try to do in a really short time is say these ideas were recognized to some extent by the founders as important for the republic that they desired, and what life would look like for ordinary people inside of that society, right? So that's really important, is I think as economists, what we want to focus on is how do ordinary people live in societies, right? Because the elites do well all the time. Perhaps not as well as they could if they had more economic freedom, but they don't always recognize that. So there were disagreements. And I just want to focus on property rights. I realize this is a PowerPoint violation, which is to have a lot of text, but I wanted to have a few quotes. The Continental Congress declared in 1774, by the immutable laws of nature, people are entitled to their property. So this is a recognition, again, right, of ownership. And again, so there's a justice argument here, but in a minute we'll see the efficacy argument too. The Virginia Declaration of Rights talks about property being an inherent right. It's natural, essential, and unalienable. Moreover, and this is the efficacy part, it yields prosperity. And that is recognized as a good thing. Charleston, South Carolina affirmed that without property rights, soon would desolation frown over the uncultivated earth. So the notion was, and remember, this is at the time largely an agrarian farming society, right? That would experience lots of change, and that change would yield certainly different manufacturers, different industry, different types of innovation, and of course we're living in the results and the fruits of all of that now, but that it would also yield tranquility, peacefulness, cooperation, and peaceful coexistence, which is what we want, of course. James Madison's Federalist 10 says, diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate, the protection of these faculties is the first object of government. So we can talk about the protective version of function of government and the productive version of government, right? And so here, founders are thinking about what is the protective version of government. It serves to protect the rights that you already have by nature of being a human, right? So the state is not a giver and a taker away of rights. It does not ordain you with rights. It rather protects what you already have. This is, of course, a radical idea, right? And so George Washington was very fond of this biblical reference to people sitting under their vine and fig tree. And he writes about this many times. He says, may the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. So George Washington's this idea that he's articulating here, and of course there's kind of biblical references that this is pulled from, but I think very deeply connected to the long millennia tradition of thinking about human flourishing, both theologically and philosophically, is that we have ownership, right? We reap the fruits of our labor, such that the vision here is that everybody has their own vine and fig tree and enjoys the fruits of it, and in that ownership, we have less to be afraid of. So these are important ideas, and I think that that helps us understand the context. And I'm going to avoid policy debates at the moment, but I think right now we're at a time, right, in American politics where there's a lot of divisiveness. There's a lot of questioning of what, kind of the original ideas and what are we really after? What should we be fighting for? And so it's hard to wade through those ideological debates, right? So many of you are college students, and I remember both being in college and in graduate school and loving staying up till 2 a.m., right? And like fighting someone, just verbally, right? But like fighting over things you disagreed about, and it was fun to stay up, right? But never, and maybe I'm just not good at argumentation, but never in those talks did the person on the other side of what I was trying to say said, thank you so much for changing my mind. I'm going to change who I vote for. I have changed everything because you've convinced me. Now, I'm not saying that diplomacy and conversation, they're actually really important. But I think what economics can lend to this, and I'm an economist, so that's kind of what I'm focusing on here, is the empirical relationship between the government we desire and the type of society we want to live in, both commercially and socially. And so in the literature, there's comes up actually the former Probasco chair, J.R. Clark and Bob Lawson, who are people who've thought a lot about economic freedom, wrote an article kind of examining what I'm going to talk about just now called the Hayek-Friedman hypothesis. So these are two Nobel laureate economists, Milton Friedman, F.A. Hayek. They kind of separately in their own work are thinking about these big ideas. Milton Friedman is involved in the first economic freedom of the world reports, which start in the 70s, and this is to try to empirically measure how open, how free, how commercial a society is. And so today we rank countries from 0 to 10. 10 is a perfect score. 0 means you have no economic freedom. And we rank countries every year. So the index just came out a couple days ago. So we're really good at measuring economic freedom. And what we see, what the Hayek-Friedman hypothesis suggests, is very kind of not an intuitive idea, I don't think, but very important for this context we're talking about in Constitution Day. Whoops. And that idea is that, which comes from this, is that you cannot have political freedom without first having economic freedom. So economic freedom is a necessary but not sufficient condition for political freedom. Meaning if you want political liberalism, if you want what most people refer to institutions that are democracy, right, in some kind of the resemble democracy, then you must have free and open markets first. I'll say one thing. If that's true, it should probably radically alter the way we think about foreign policy. But that's another talk if you guys invite me back another day. Right? So they also thought about the spontaneous ordering of social phenomenon. Right? So Hayek is really key for our thinking here, which is that the economy is not the product of someone's mind. It's not like being an architect, right? So an architect designed this building, and then many, many people were hired that had lots of different types of specializations and skills, and they made the building come to be. That's not how economies work, right? And so the false notion that smart people can kind of build an economy and then execute it actually leads to lots of economic problems and economic malaise. And it certainly won't get you political liberalism and democracy. So understanding this is really important. And what we know is true is that they have kind of societies that tend to have lots of economic freedom are more likely to have not only political freedom, but civil liberties. Okay? So the data on these things are knowable, transparent, and repeated over and over again. Then comes Michael Novak. So for those who have read his book, he writes The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, and he's a Catholic thinking about kind of in his own journey from supporting kind of more of a socialist type of society to a more, you know, kind of free market democratic type of society. So he's a kind of a moral philosopher thinking about that and his own changed opinion on that. And here's what he said. He kind of talks about the three-legged stool. So he says a society rich in human flourishing has to have political liberty, economic liberty, and moral/cultural liberty. So this is where religious freedom comes in, right? People have to be free to live out their faith outside of the doors of their house. And that's going to be complicated. It's not going to be easy, but it's part of cultural pluralism, right? Which is where we can coexist among each other in this commercial, politically liberal order and disagree about things that are sacred, but peacefully coexist. This is a tall order, of course, right? Because I showed you that what we call that hockey stick graph. Economic growth was nothing for most of human history. Political liberalism, non-existent. Religious freedom, none of that either. So it's not a coincidence that in that same time people lived in economically immiserating conditions. So the way I kind of have been thinking about this, and I think this nicely talks about the interplay between religious freedom, political freedom, and economic freedom, is that they need each other. So when I think about kind of the three spheres of human life, this is kind of 100,000 foot level thinking, right? You have the state, and you have the market, and you have civil society. This is kind of my way of thinking about it, right? So the state has the power of coercion. That's what's unique about the state. It can tell you what to do, and it can punish you for not doing it. So if I deduct some money from my federal taxes because I don't like X, Y, or Z program, I get to go to jail, right? So they have the power of coercion. The market, right? This is where we buy and sell and exchange goods and services with one another. But it's not saying, in a market economy, there's no power to coerce, right? So I have to choose to go to, Starbucks or shop at Amazon or wherever I'm going to go. And then I think in some ways this is neglected by economists, although we're getting better at it, this element of civil society where there's these kind of non-market, non-state institutions that are really important for human interaction, and one of the most fundamental, I would say, is the family, right? That's where we're raised. That's where we kind of work together in a household production function, if you will, to produce things, right? But also churches, nonprofit organizations, community organizations. And so in the market, what's distinct is that the market allocates resources through private property, prices, and profits and losses. That's the mechanism by which scarce resources are allocated and reallocated. Right? In the state, that's not how things are done, right? The state is done by order or by command or by directive, right? So the federal government can say, we want more schools, or we want more roads, or we want more tanks, right? But they don't buy them, essentially. They just direct it through congressional budgets and make it happen, right? But that money has to come from somewhere. Civil society is similar in that they're not using profit and loss, right? So think about when you go to the Red Cross to donate blood. You're not paid to do that. So there's something else that's motivating you to go, and there's something that's motivating them to exist as an institution, which is to offer support to the community. All of these things are overlapping, yet they have separate functions, and they work and operate in separate ways. Robust societies which are on that path, right? There's no society that has perfect human flourishing, and there never will be. We can't get perfection, we can't seek perfectionism. But I think the overlap of these institutions allows individuals different avenues by which to cooperate, right? To aid each other, to fill in voids and gaps. And I think Tocqueville here, to me, is really important for our understanding. So what Tocqueville saw when he was touring the United States as a Frenchman, he said, one of my favorite quotes from Democracy in America is he said, Americans love civil associations. He says, when a Frenchman has a problem, they go to the government to solve it. When the American has a problem, they start an association. So we saw all these associations everywhere, right? To help orphans, to help women, to help with education, to the first provisions of hospital care, by the way, in the United States were done entirely through charitable giving, right? And what he saw, what Tocqueville witnessed was, it was actually religious freedom that compelled people to go into the public square, if you will, and say, for example, my faith dictates that I help the poor. And therefore, I'm going to start a community organization to fill that gap. So what Tocqueville saw was important is there's a society that has lots of civic freedoms and cultural pluralism that is brought on by these interacting institutions, allows people to come together and cooperate even if they disagree. Right? And that's what's important. And I think when you think about the political landscape of today, these are the questions that we might want to ask ourselves. Are these things in jeopardy? Because I think if they go in the other direction, then you start to see a different kind of society. So here's an example. I don't have time to get into it really, but there's another empirical index called the Human Freedom Index. And I think it's really helpful for kind of advancing some of these ideas and measurements of things we think are important. And this comes from their index. China has 7 don't speaks. So these are things that it is illegal to speak of. I note here things I just talked about as being so important for a robust society of free people. Universal values, freedom of speech, civil society, and civil rights. Right? You're also not supposed to talk about crony capitalism and the historical errors of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is an authoritarian regime that is trying to stomp out freedom of thought. Why would they want to stomp out freedom of religion? Because they don't want you getting your identity from anything other than the state. Because that's how you serve the state, right? So this is not unique to China. This is typical of authoritarian regimes, right? So they actually want to rid the society of any notion of religious freedom, let alone religious tolerance. It's very important for the authoritarian agenda, okay? And so something, again, I think we need to take that really seriously. So economic freedom, we measure it in these ways. These are kind of the 5 indicators or 5 pillars, 5 cornerstones of economic freedom. Again, I mentioned the founders were committed to some of these in varying degrees, very specifically property rights and delineating the powers of the government, right? They understood the threat of tyranny, and so we can have a lot of conversations about the robustness of the Constitution, but this was something they were worried about, is the progression towards an increasing government in size and scope. So what are some of the things we know? And I'll just show you some of the a few of the empirical results. We know that economic freedom, for 40 years we've been measuring it, time and time again. If you live in a society with lots of economic freedom, indicated by the blue bar, then you have a lot higher per capita income. So this is a correlation, right? So that's one thing that is very robust in the studies on this. So economic freedom, living in that type of society. Again, why do we care about income? Not just for its own sake, because when you have more income, you have more choices. You're not forced inward to do everything on your own, right? This requires that we live in a society where we collaborate with strangers. Like, think about shopping at Amazon. Not only are you collaborating with strangers, but you're collaborating with like non-humans, right? There's a human behind that stuff. But I just put stuff in my cart and they take a credit card. And there's people, right? But you have to have a high level of trust to do that. You have to have a very high level of trust to live in a society where you do that, right? If anybody has had their house worked on by a contractor, or do you have house cleaners that come to your house? They might come to your house when you're not home. High levels of social trust to live in a world where you allow that to happen, right? So what gives us that trust? It's economic freedom, political freedom, religious freedom working together. Religious freedom, I just wanted to show you some results. So the data on religious freedom is really not as good as the data we have on economic freedom and political freedom, but there are efforts to try to make it better. In fact, today, I couldn't go. I was invited to another event where First Liberty, the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy, released religious freedom of the 50 states. So I have not, it just came out today, so I've had no time to look at it, but I just want to share that because not only do we measure it on a global scale, but now there's efforts made to measure it on a state-by-state scale, and I think the way they do it is to look at different laws and give states a score. And I think you'll be happy to know Tennessee is number 7. I did look that up in case I was asked. So we have data from Pew, number 7. And we have data from Pew and data from the World Values Survey, and I think this is I'll just share some of it because I'm running out of time. But if you look at government and social hostility to religion, so that's some of the data we have. We can look at the social hostility, so in other words, are the people in your society hostile in general to religion or to certain religions? And then we can separately look at government hostility to religion. And what we see, this is the Tocquevillian kind of idea coming out, as hostility towards religion, both from your peers, your citizens, and from the state increases, your participation in social groups, in political groups, in civic groups, even in sports groups goes down. So that's one, I thought, I'm in football country, so look at this. So if you live in a society that's kind of most free in terms of religious freedom, you get the share of the population. So if you go from the least free to the most free, right? It's almost double the participation in sports groups. And we might say, who cares? It's sports. I'm in the South. Sports are very important, right? But this is a way that people engage and have commonalities with people that they might disagree with on everything else. So this provides social cohesion, and it's a pacifying factor. And it's really important for civil society. Community groups, look at that jump. So if you have high levels of religious freedom as we understand it and currently are able to measure it, 72% participation in social groups, right? Because there's freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of social and physical mobility. So I'm just going to stop talking, but I guess my conclusion here is that I think you need all three together. I think we've done a lot of good work as economists understanding the relationships between political freedom and economic freedom, and now I think the work is to try to understand how religious freedom matters. People like really nice causation stories, right? So some people want religious freedom to explain everything else. Some people want economic freedom to explain everything else. I'm not sure I'm committed to that yet. I just know that the three are positively correlated. So if you live in and there's kind of new papers coming out on this, but if you live in a society with more religious freedom, you're more likely to have economic freedom and vice versa. Now the question is, can you keep it? Right? And what are the risks socially of those things declining? So I'll stop. I'm probably out of time. Thank you.
hear me okay? Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm going to move this a little bit. I just want to thank Dr. Ellington and the Center for Reflective Citizenship for the opportunity to be a part of this, and to Dr. Bradley for generously agreeing to share the stage with me. It's quite a pleasure to be here. Over the years, Lucien has done an amazing job enriching the intellectual life of this campus by bringing in such interesting and dynamic speakers, and I think tonight is proof of that. So it's a real pleasure to talk to you, and there's another reason why it's an extra pleasure to be here tonight. It's the first public lecture I've given with my children present. And not all of them, they might have taken up with the whole row over there if all of them were here. But I promise, I have a standing promise that I won't do anything to unduly embarrass them. So I won't tell any bad dad jokes. So I'll just jump right into it. When I think about economic freedom, I like to go back to dates when I think about the American founding and the American tradition. We think about 1787, the Constitution of the United States. We might think about 1776, the Declaration of Independence. But another date comes to mind, rewind a little further, 1764. Does that date ring a bell with anyone out there? Does anyone remember the significance of 1764 in American history? I see some high school and junior high students out there. Feel free to yell it out if you. What piece of legislation did the British Parliament pass? The Stamp Act. I think I heard someone say it. And what was the result of the Stamp Act? Well, America licked the British. I'm sorry, I broke my promise. I'll just leave the stage now. But in all seriousness, right, we can trace back this thinking about why did this country begin. It really began in a dispute over did the American colonists have a right to consent to the taking of their property? Did they have a right to representation in Parliament? And quoted for us one of the most frequently cited Bible verses in American writing in the revolutionary tradition, Micah 4:4. That every man, there was a prophetic vision that every man would have his own fig tree and sit under his own vine. It was actually the verse most frequently cited of any Bible verse by George Washington. I think that's a telling mingling of a concern for or a belief in economic freedom and the right of property, as it were, believed to be supported by the biblical tradition. Now, I want to make this point. Even though we frequently see the Bible as the most frequently appealed to piece of literature among the founding generation in arguing about politics, one didn't have to believe as a Christian or as a Jew to affirm these principles. And the founders are very explicit about this. They explicitly ground their political philosophy, their account of religious and economic freedom, in the natural law. As the Declaration of Independence says, the laws of nature and nature's God provide the ground for those unalienable rights. And so I thought maybe I would speak a little bit to you about that tradition and what it is and how it informed how the Americans thought about this. What is the natural law? We can think about it actually going off of something Anne was talking about, which is this idea of shalom, right? The idea of peace, happiness, right? The term that was used by the ancient Greeks, eudaimonia, if you break it down, eu, meaning well or wellness, daimon, soul, so a kind of wellness of soul. It wasn't, in the ancient Greek idea, mere subjective contentment. I just feel good. No, it was a kind of activity in accord with virtue, in the pursuit of things that were objectively good, objectively necessary, required for well-being, for happiness, for flourishing. The natural law tradition latches onto that and says, yeah, that's right. Now you might say, well, how do we know what it is that's necessary for human flourishing? I was thinking about this last week when my daughter, who's here tonight, came up and was talking to me about her observations of the cardinals in the backyard. A male and a female cardinals were flying around doing their thing. And it really got me thinking about what the natural law claim is. The natural lawyer claims that we can know what's good for things by observing nature. This is a great example. I asked her, I said, how do you know whether or not the cardinal is happy? I said, well, is it if it's flying around, if it's chirping, if they're eating bugs, if they're getting worms, if they are watching over the eggs in the nest, sitting on the nest. And I said, and how do you know whether or not the cardinal is unhappy, not flourishing, not doing well? Well, if it's not doing those activities, if it seems like it's lethargic, laying on the ground, and a wing is injured, it's not able to perform those functions, it's not able to perform the kinds of activities proper to being a cardinal, living a cardinally life. Natural lawyers claim something similar about human nature. That in virtue of the kinds of things human beings are, there are objects, goods, that we need to pursue to be happy, to flourish, to live a fulfilled life. And human beings share much with animals like the cardinals. We have a body that has bodily needs for food, for shelter, for rest, etc. But we're also rational. We're rational animals. So we have something further that helps us to identify distinct goods, things that are necessary for us to live and to live well. Okay, so the natural lawyer believes that, okay, right, life is good. Health is good. Bodily health is good. And therefore, those things destructive of that should be avoided. Right? Having and rearing children is a good. Right? And so family, marriage, home, these things are goods. And those sorts of behaviors that are destructive of those things, those should be avoided. And there's a kind of sharing that human beings have with other animals on this regard, but there's also something distinctive, right? We can, because we have the powers of intellect and reason, we can know things. We can distinguish between truth and falsehood. We can distinguish between good and evil. Maybe even distinguish between beauty and ugliness. And part of that ability is the ability to debate these things. It's not always necessarily obvious what those things are. We deliberate, we debate, we discuss. We are intrinsically social creatures. We need community, we need friendship. Therefore, we need government, we need society to help coordinate our actions. But there's something else that being a rational animal leads us to wonder about. All of these goods seem to leave us not fully satisfied. We still seem to be longing for perhaps the very ground of goodness, truth, and beauty. Now, why do I say that? Well, and then this is the source of the religious instinct. Now, you might say, well, okay, that reasoning seems kind of spurious, because just because someone is hungry doesn't mean he has bread. And of course, C.S. Lewis, who's one of the great Christian natural lawyers of the 20th century, addressed this objection, and he said, yeah, that's true. Just because you're hungry doesn't mean that you're immediately going to have bread there. But the fact of your hungering implies that you're the kind of being that eats substances to repair your body, and that you're the kind of being that lives in the kind of world where that's available. And so this idea of a longing for full satiation, for complete happiness, is one sign, the classical natural lawyer thinks, that there is such an object available. There is, say, a paradise that one can seek after. This, the classical natural lawyer thinks, is the source in human nature for religion. And indeed, it's the reason why religion is thought to be a good, something worth pursuing the truth about whatever greater than human source, meaning, truth, goodness, and beauty might exist. And so, the founders affirmed the goodness of religion, in part because it was this object of human striving that they saw manifest around them in the religious traditions in the founding era. And indeed, the founders in various ways affirmed a story about the importance of religion. From the forgotten founders like James Otis and John Dickinson, to founders who've been remembered more recently like John Witherspoon, James Wilson, Alexander Hamilton, even the more heterodox, quote-unquote, founders like Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, all affirmed the goodness and importance of religion for a fulfilled human life. And indeed, one of the greatest statements of this view was from George Washington, who said that religion and morality were the indispensable supports of political prosperity, the great pillars of human happiness. And indeed, because it was a good, the founders believed it was a duty. Madison defined religion as the duty we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it. Now, so far I've sort of given you a little picture of how natural law sort of reflects on this. What about natural rights? Well, Madison teaches that it's because that duty is so important, it's because that it's so fundamental, it's prior to any claim the civil government can make on you. There's nothing more important. And that's why we have to have religious freedom. This cannot be something coerced by civil government. It needs to be something that's the conviction of your conscience. So the right to free exercise of religion was grounded in the goodness of religion and the duty to try to pursue, right, these questions, to seek after God or the gods or some higher meaning. And so the Free Exercise Clause, the Establishment Clause, I think can be illuminated in the First Amendment by recognizing that this was not some idiosyncratic, arbitrary preference. Oh, I want to go to church. It's no different than going to the football game. That's one view. That's actually the predominant view that constitutional scholars take today, that religion's just one other sub-rational preference. You might want to go to church. Right? You might want to go golf. We can't weigh these things. That's the sort of radical autonomy view of religion. That's one possible view, and you can make a case for that view, but that wasn't the founders' view, and it wasn't the view presupposed by the Constitution. We pick out religious freedom because of its importance and centrality. It's the first freedom in the Bill of Rights for this reason, I think. And the founders, I think, wanted to protect this because, in conjunction with economic freedom, and they saw these as closely linked. James Madison, in his little essay on property, talked about how we have a kind of dominion over external goods, right? Your car, your house, the computer in your pocket, those would be external goods. But you also have a dominion over your opinions, your beliefs. They're both your property. They belong to you. And so your religious views, he picks out, this is central to your very dignity. Just like the things that you own are central to your dignity. And they're closely linked in Madison's mind, and this is why he opposes a religious establishment in Virginia, which would have exacted property from taxpayers to go to support a specific religious sect. And so, right, these things are linked together, and the thought is that we have to keep economic and religious matters maximally free. But I would also note that, and this just in closing, that the Establishment Clause of the Constitution was primarily intended to protect religious freedom in this sense, by prohibiting a nationally established church. This was the principal reason why it was ratified. Religion was largely left, in terms of specific matters of accommodation and how church-state would work, to the states. This was something that was reserved within the state's powers under the 10th Amendment. That was the case throughout our history until 1948, when the Supreme Court said that the Establishment Clause was effective against the states. But that was constitutionally incorrect. So, I'll just, maybe let's close with that. Thank you.
We'll give Dr. Bradley. Professor Cooper can come in again.
Great, thank you. I think that your contextualization of the way the founders thought about the specifics of religious freedom is really important as we think about it today. So I'm hoping maybe, I just really have a series of questions for him rather than comments, but so you can riff off of whatever you want. But I think it seems to me that this is really important for the modern debates we're having about what religious freedom looks like today in the 21st century and what that means. And this kind of, Jeffersonian phrase of the wall, right? And that creates a lot of problems in terms of interpretation of that and what that means. And I think the notion, right, that of religious freedom that's very consistent with both political liberalism and economic freedom that you were mentioning is it's the private pursuit of truth, rather than running around and checking in on what people are doing on Sundays or any other day, right? And so I think it's about a private quest for seeking truth and being able then, if you feel that you've discovered it, to live it out in very personal ways. So the manifestation of these ideas is highly voluntary and extremely personal. And I want to hear what you think, but I think people have a tough time with that. Because I think either we want people to believe what we believe or what we think the truth is, and I think that's a normal human inclination. But the question is, again, taking it back to the founders, what the intention of the protection was in the first place, which is to protect the private sphere of the quest for truth, and that in doing that, we're actually protecting commerce, we're protecting community, we're protecting family. And so I think those are all really important things. Economist Timur Kran says, if you restrict religious freedom, then you actually restrict ideas. It's not just commerce. It's just that, because when you think about what commerce is, it's not just exchanging stuff. It's exchanging ideas about property rights and contracts and exchange and values, and that gets to me, back for me, to the trust issue, which obviously is so essential if we're going to live in a large society where mostly we don't know each other, right? So anyway, you can react to any of that or none of it, whatever you want.
Well, so I guess a couple things there. One is kind of the characterization of protecting this private sphere, and then you also are wondering about what it looks like today or how it should look today. I think that it's correct to say that the founders wanted to have a robust civil society where people could pursue the truth and that government shouldn't have a heavy hand intervening into. I think that's all right. I think that the tension of thinking through the founders' way of thinking about this stuff is, on the other hand, someone like John Adams says, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people and none other. Any other would be like a whale through a net. What does that mean? Well, he thought that the Constitution was a limited government, worked if people had practiced virtues, like the kind of things that Tocqueville was talking about, that they believed that it was good, it was their religious duty to love their fellow human beings, to engage in publicly spirited acts, to engage in charity, to engage in self-sacrifice for the common good, without being coerced by the government to do it. Right? The whale through the net is the idea of the people would be the whale and the Constitution would be the net. It would be the people whose passions are unbridled, who act entirely selfishly, who do not think of their fellow man, and unleash the passions in terms of crime, in terms of antisocial behavior. Right? You can't have a limited government function in that case, because now government's got to grow more and more police, a bigger police state, to try to keep the whale in check. And so religious freedom works when people are, I think, pursuing broadly within the bounds of a kind of natural law morality, serious religious endeavor. I think that is pluralistic. I think it's inclusive, but there are limits, I think, from the founder's perspective about how inclusive it could be if people turned against some of these habits that Tocqueville said were necessary, some of these moral principles that were at home within some of these religious traditions. I don't know what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that that's talking about how, I mean, your point about there has to be an underlying ethos, even for, I think, a market economy to work, right? So a market economy has to be based on a respect for private property. So that's why I see these things as very overlapping and not distinct silos. So you can think about democracy as a bucket here, and we want to get more of that. That's kind of the consensus. And we want more, maybe more markets over here, although that's highly debated, right? I would say that's a good thing. And then we want more religious freedom, and we act as if they're separate categories of the world or our lives. And so I think that the underlying ethos of all of that has to be a respect for our fellow human beings and an embracing of human dignity. And so the question is, if that erodes, what do you do about it, and where do you go from there? And so, and even how do we measure if that's really happening? I don't even know if you can measure it by church attendance, right? So one of the things we can measure is the number of people that claim a certain religion, and we know that that's declining in the United States, right? That there's nuns, right? So they check none. The question is, how worried should we be about that, right? I think it probably depends on your religious point of view to some extent, but I do think, the question that those surveys don't touch is, well, what are the nuns doing? They're probably not doing nothing. If it's connected to our humanity and the pursuit of truth for fulfillment, then there's something going on even with the nuns.
Mm-hmm. That's N-O-N-E-S,
Yeah.
not N-U-N-S.
Right.
In case you were wondering,
Good.
we don't have a huge uptick in vocations to the nunnery. So yes, I saw some data recently that that the Americans do not identify as Christian is one of its lowest points ever, mid-60s, and the nuns are at a much higher percentage, 15-20%. Now I do think if you break down within the category of nuns, you see that a very large, the majority of them are not actually self-identified as agnostic or atheist. They identify as spiritual but not going to a particular church, so whatever difference that makes. I would just say to this point about religion, the relationship of religiosity to, say, social capital. Tim Carney's book, Alienated America, is worth looking at here if you're interested in this question. He shows that social capital, the areas where there's the highest levels of social trust, where you can have most likely be able to depend on your neighbor and have high levels of friendship to help carry the burdens of life are those parts of the country with the highest levels of religious church attendance and church participation, religious participation. So I don't think that's coincidental. I don't think that's a coincidence, because when you're part of a religious community, you have a kind of bond. You have a kind of social. It's a hell of a social glue. I say hell advisedly. That to bring people together under a shared ideal, and there you have very, very different people, but then start to build friendships that you wouldn't otherwise have built, and those radiate out into the life of the community. And so this is why people like Tocqueville, all the way today to someone like Robert Putnam, believe that these kinds of associations are so important for the maintenance of a healthy democracy and republic. Yeah.
I'm going to cut us off here, and we have, again, a very robust Q&A tradition in here. So it's now your turn, and you can, again, as long as you don't make a speech, ask, I'll have to intervene, but ask questions of either, both. You can queue up at the mic, and it'll be fun. So, and I'll mention as people come up, just because there are people who live in Georgia in here, including me, and Tennessee was what? 7th. Georgia was tied for 36th with Wisconsin, which has got us all. We haven't seen the data, but that's really interesting.
And DC was where?
I don't know. But I invite people to queue up. Questions? Here comes one. Great.
This is just to both of you to maybe comment on a couple of things I noticed. So the graph, that first graph was 1820, and I wonder if there's potential prosperity before 1820. And then, is there a cost to human flourishing given all the political economic freedom? Some philosophic traditions, some natural law traditions are going to say there's a cost to all of that. And we've mentioned Tocqueville a number of times, and he's going to say something. There's a certain sadness to what's going on in the modern world. And so just a couple of comments on that I'm hoping for. Thank you.
Questions? Would you like to respond?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. That's good question. Good questions. So I'm gonna defer on prior to 1820 prosperity. Maybe I could try the Tocqueville. The sadness. I'm also. You may be also gesturing towards some other later critiques as well of modernity. I do think that there is a legitimate critique to be made of a kind of version of modernity. The great Leo Strauss quipped in summarizing John Locke, who is one of the great political philosophers of private property, capitalism. The founders had Locke in the Bible, in one hand and one in the other. That if you want to summarize John Locke, it's this: it's the joyless quest for joy. Right? In other words, the idea of you unleash the sort of acquisitive spirit to just gain, and for what? And I think if economic freedom is uncoupled from some kind of outlet for fulfillment for the deeper spiritual strivings, that's where you're going to have the sadness, because it's not going to be fulfilling. It'll be the joyless quest for joy. That's the sadness. I don't know if you agree with that, but that's my take.
And can you comment on that? Is that just mumbo jumbo when it comes to what the numbers actually show?
No, I don't think it's mumbo jumbo. I think it's a real thing that even Adam Smith himself was worried about this. So at one point he says, you have to realize the time in which he's writing this, which is the middle of the 18th century, and he says, people are just going to want a gold-plated ear picker. They didn't have Q-tips, right? So it's like, it's not enough that I have one. I have to have a gold-plated one. He was right to identify that then. It's correct now. So I do think that economic freedom, though, isn't just about materialism, but I think we can't talk about human flourishing without including material advancement and well-being. So those things have to be deeply connected. Prior to 1820, there was the beginnings of economic growth. But prior to 1750, there was no sustained economic growth. So Bob Lucas has a great little article that he published in 2004 called Industrial Revolution, Past and Future. And it's a really amazing article that helps us understand the history of economic growth, which was mostly nothing for a long time. It was just stagnant. And so it wasn't really until 1900 that you make a major milestone in terms of income. And so, but at the same, so these are all great things that I personally celebrate. I think economists generally celebrate them. But it's not for the sake of the stuff, right? So there is a lot of problem with envious, meddlesome preferences and all these types of things, right? It's like my neighbor has a Land Rover or whatever, and I have an old Honda minivan, and I feel bad about myself. Like, this stuff is real, but it's just part of being human. So no amount of wealth creation is going to eliminate that, but that's why I think utopianism is really dangerous on all sides, right? Market economies aren't going to give you a perfect world. Neither is the perfectly written Constitution or Bill of Rights. It's not, because we're dealing with broken people who make mistakes. And so, it's the question of these things, are they better than the alternatives? And I think the evidence is very clear that political liberalism and economic freedom and religious freedom are far better than the alternatives. But it doesn't mean if I die with 7 Porsches, I win, because I don't. I just die, right? And they stay here. So that is sobering and sad if that's your pursuit. So I do think those are very real concerns. And when economists only talk about income all the time, we don't help with the perceptions that that's all we care about. So, yeah.
Questions?
I really have 2 questions, and they are currently in debate today. The first is, you talk about sound money, and the idea that the argument about a national bank or a Federal Reserve. So I'd like you to comment about how sound our currency is today, which, and I won't go in, I could, but I won't. So inflation is an issue when your government doesn't make your national currency sound. So I'd like you to comment on that. The other is the recent debate over the executive order by President Biden to totally rewrite Title IX. Because within that executive order, it's the same thing that Canada had such an issue with that caused the creation of their tribunals under the Human Rights Commission, which is compelled speech.
Let's get the, I remember both the questions, so I'll just repeat them in order.
Okay.
So, and you heard the first one was assess the soundness of the currency, and the second one was what about executive orders on Title IX, and whoever does the Title IX, just remind people.
You want me to take sound money?
Sure, yeah.
I'll take sound money. I think that right now, Americans are very dialed in to what's happening in the Federal Reserve, which is kind of funny, right, to think about what happens at the dinner table. I think most of the time people don't talk about the Federal Reserve. And so it's indicative of what's going on. Certainly, I think you've got a lot of events that are creating this perfect storm, which includes living under a global pandemic and the United States government response to that, and the reactions of the Federal Reserve to that. So the new CPI data came out, right, and we're at 8.3. We were at 8.5. So, it's not good news. The Fed's target rate is what, 2%? And so everybody recognizes that this is a problem. I don't remember, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but something like, and I know there's economists in the room so they can correct me, but something like 80% of the currency in circulation was printed in the last 2 years. That should strike you as ridiculous, right? Because as Milton Friedman said, you know, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and what he meant by that, which is the second, you know, sentence in that clause, is that when the supply of money outpaces the demand for money. So it's, in some ways, the economics behind what the Fed should do are simple but not easy. But I think the Fed has become completely politicized. I think they're engaging in unorthodox measures, and I think that was facilitated by experiencing COVID. But in addition to that, we had already budget problems and spending problems that were really exacerbated during the pandemic, and there's just more of that on the horizon. So, you know, I think that it can be corrected. I mean, I think you can correct inflation by taking steps in monetary policy to do that, but I think it's like the ultimate thing is we have to deal with the source of the problems, right? So it has to be a constrained central bank. And one more thing I'll say, and then we'll talk Title IX, but I think it's easy to believe as an American that you've been born in a country with lots of freedom. You've been born in a country where people are currently, you know, compared to the rest of the world, very wealthy. And Americans view themselves as the good guys. And so it's hard to imagine that you could collapse, that system could collapse. But I think what economic freedom teaches us when you really study it is that there's no economic destiny. And that's really important. I actually think the founders understood this. There's no destiny. Right? So we can wreck our economy, we can wreck our political institutions, we can wreck our civil society, and Venezuela is a terrible story of that unfolding in front of our eyes. And so soundness of currency is a really important pillar of economic freedom, and when you lose that, the kind of vacuum of power opens up really widely. And I think then it's hard to rein it back in. So I think sound money cannot be understated. You know, we can't talk about it enough.
You want to take Title IX? And probably some people would, you know, there are a lot of titles, so definition in order would be probably a good one.
Okay, so Title IX has to do with forbidding of sex discrimination, but I actually haven't read the executive order the questioner was referring to. I don't know if, is this sort of referring to gender identity type stuff, or what were you?
It would make it illegal to not use someone's preferred pronoun.
Okay. Yeah, so let me come at it at that from a first principles perspective, which is to say, why do we protect freedom of speech, free exercise of religion? Well, again, go back to what I was talking about. The seeking after the answers to the most fundamental questions is so important that maximal freedom to pursue that and to live out the convictions of one's religious convictions, what one believes, has to be protected, or you no longer live in a free country. And so the Supreme Court has a very strong, pretty strong tradition of protecting citizens against coerced speech. The one case, one of my students is here, could maybe remind me. The case is Woolley v. Maynard, but I don't remember the year. It's a 70s or 80s case. There was a fella in New Hampshire who didn't like the motto of New Hampshire on his license plate. Does anyone know what the motto is? Live free or die. I don't believe that. I'd rather die. You can't make me carry your message around New Hampshire. And what does the Supreme Court say? Oh, no, you got to let him have his own personal license plate. You can't make. So if if that is protected against coerced speech, then I think you could probably work out the deduction of how the Supreme Court might approach this issue.
Question.
Yes, this is for Dr. Cooper. So my understanding of constitutions is perhaps unfortunately informed by economics. So I'm an economist by training, so that's how I think about these things. Two things I'd be curious in hearing your opinion on. To what extent do you think the religious wars of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries weighed on the founders' minds when thinking about religious toleration? One argument I've heard is that a regime of religious toleration is one way of taking those kind of contentious issues off the table, right? So it's saying, if this is beyond the pale of government, then you can't use the state to impose your preferences, whatever way. So it basically kind of diffuses those conflicts because it removes them from the public sphere. So I wonder, how much do you think that influenced their thinkings? And the second one was, there's a really interesting book out in 2019 by two economic historians where they make the case that the emergence of religious toleration had less to do with Enlightenment philosophy, not nothing, but less to do, and more with the economic benefits to integrating individuals into their society. There was a point where, for example, the British monarchs realized it's more profitable to allow Jews to practice here than persecute them. There are economic reasons to extend tolerance. Just wondering if you had any thoughts on those kind of more economic interpretations or theories as to why you saw toleration become so important in the religious sphere.
Oh, great question. Thank you. And I was hoping we would hear something about public choice economics there. I might have caught the subtext a little bit. Okay, so the idea of the wars of religion certainly has a very powerful influence on the imagination of Enlightenment thinking. I think that's correct to say. I think that the point I would want to make is one needs to distinguish strains of the Enlightenment. Okay, so the American experience of the Enlightenment is very different than, say, the French. The French Revolution, there was one of the quips attributed to, I can't remember if it was not Voltaire, but one of the philosophes. The quip was, to secure freedom, we need to strangle kings at the entrails of priests. That's one way of securing religious freedom and ending religious warfare, to just kill all the clergy. Okay, that wasn't the American way. The American choice was to try to secure religious freedom and toleration in a way that saw religion as a good. That was kind of one of the points I was trying to make, is that it wasn't seen as an evil. Now, it's susceptible to abuse, and that's where the public choice economists actually agree with Madison. The public choice economists think that
Questions?
My question is, how does your view of natural law affect your view of immigration and immigrants?
You want to start?
Do you want to go?
No, go ahead. You started with natural law, and I took the last one. I'll talk about immigration, though.
Okay. My view of or do you want my view or how the founders thought about this?
I want both of them.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a big question. It's almost overwhelming but I'll try to say a few things. Natural law, natural rights, it's fairly abstract, sort of, at least the way the founders thought about it, baseline of basic moral principles and the ground of rights protections. Now, within this sort of framework, there's a broad set of possibilities for how to order your polity. But I think that it is within the realm of permitted prudence for citizens to form a polity and establish rules for entry and exit of that polity. Right, citizens would, by natural right, have the capacity to set the terms for citizenship and entry and exit into that community. So what implications does that have for immigration? Well, citizens would have the authority to make laws regarding naturalization, say. The immigrant is also a natural rights bearer. And the founders very much wanted to attract immigrants to the country. And indeed, that was one of their biggest arguments for religious freedom, was that if we establish religious freedom here, we're going to be a beacon to the world and people are going to come here. So they wanted people to come, and they thought they'd be attracted to coming because they would be free to practice their faith. So I know those are some of the things that come to mind. They were pro-immigration in that sense, I think, but they also believed that citizens could had the authority to set the boundaries for who is coming, when they're coming, and the number of people coming. How does that sound?
My interpretation is that, I think that immigration is, to me, a natural part of self-determination. And it's hard to think about, the notion that you're born in a very poor place and you have the perhaps chance or ability to change locations and change all of that, right? To deny that. So I wouldn't argue that there shouldn't be perhaps no rules. But I think the problem today, and you didn't necessarily ask about that, is that it's extremely complex and very hard to come to the country. And Alex Narasta is an economist who talks a lot about this, and he's a good one, because he really goes through the complexity of who even gets a green card and the process by which you have to do that. So very few people, like under 1%, can actually obtain this. And I don't think that was the vision. I also think that the political response against this is based on some false economic premises, including kind of viewing the economic pie as zero-sum or fixed, right? So it's like if immigrants come, they're going to take our stuff, and they're also going to bring all the bad stuff with them, right? All the things they're fleeing, when the evidence tells us that kind of the opposite is true, which is, if you kind of come to Miami from Haiti, you're leaving Haiti. You want Miami, right, or somewhere else in the United States for very good reasons, so you assimilate at high levels and things like this. So I just think there's misperceptions that maybe are less philosophical, but just as important for the argument.
I'm going to conclude, but I want to make a quick announcement because we're really trying to promote viewpoint diversity, the free market of ideas. And I want to plug a program next Thursday. Some of you know Tom Sowell or know his work. Next Thursday, the Probasco chair in the Tennessee room will have Jason Riley, who is a Wall Street Journal columnist and has written a biography of Thomas Sowell. Many of it, the economic historian and economist. Some of us think he's one of the bravest people in the public square. So I just mentioned you can register. I think there's plenty of room. That's in the Tennessee room. So that's my position diversity announcement of the night. But I want to thank everyone for coming to Constitution Day, and come back next year, and have a good night.